The elevator chimed softly at 7:30. Sharp. Claire Carter stepped inside, clutching a paper cup that smelled faintly of burnt coffee. The mirrored walls caught her reflection, neat bun, tired eyes. A woman who arrived before the lights came on and left long after they dimmed. Have you ever stood in a room full of people and felt completely invisible? Outside the elevator, the floor of Cole Innovations hummed with the rhythm of another corporate morning heels clicking, printers sighing, screens blinking to life. Somewhere beyond the glass partition, Evan Cole, the man whose name crowned every door, was already at work, brilliant, impeccable, distant. Claire knew his schedule better than her own heartbeat. The black coffee at 8:00 hours, the sharp silence before meetings, the way his voice cooled a room faster than the air conditioner ever could. Yet, in 3 years, he had never once looked at her long enough to remember the color of her eyes, the scent of espresso mixed with rain drifting from the window vents. She tightened her grip on the cup, the cardboard softening under her fingers. If she'd known how much a single day could change everything, pride, pain, even love, she might have paused before stepping through that glass door. And that's how it began, the story neither of them saw coming. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime that echoed down the marble hallway. The scent of freshly brewed coffee drifted faintly through the air, mingling with the hum of printers and the sharp rhythm of heels tapping across polished floors. It was 7:30 Gandescum at Cole Innovations, and the day had begun with its usual precision, predictable, mechanical, almost cold. Claire Carter stepped out, her badge already clipped neatly to her blazer. Her breath made a faint mist against the glass as she passed the wide windows overlooking downtown Seattle. The city outside was still waking, but inside, the machine of ambition was already running at full speed. She adjusted the strap of her bag and took a sip of coffee that had long turned lukewarm. "Morning, Claire," murmured Sophie from the reception desk, her tone polite but distracted. Claire smiled anyway, the kind of smile that didn't expect a return. She was used to that, the small exchanges that began and ended before they could mean anything. The office gleamed like it had been designed to impress, not to comfort. Chrome, glass, and quiet efficiency. Every desk lined in perfect symmetry, every screen alive with charts and data. Somewhere behind the frosted glass at the far end, Evan Cole was already in his office. The founder, the genius, the man whose ambition had built an empire and whose silence could shrink a person without a word. Claire had worked for him for 3 years, long enough to know the exact sound his footsteps made when he was irritated faster, clipped, with a faint drag at the turn. Long enough to know when not to speak, when to refill his coffee before he asked, when to print reports on heavier paper because he hated the sound of flimsy sheets. She knew everything about his routines, his moods, his small, unspoken rules, and yet he had never once looked at her long enough to notice the shade of her eyes. The only thing that noticed her reflection was the glass door. She passed that door every morning, transparent, spotless, cruelly honest. Behind it, his office remained a study in restraint, dark wood, steel, and a single photograph of a mountain ridge, perfectly centered. Evan Cole himself was rarely still. He spoke in half-sentences that carried weight, in glances that could silence a room. People admired him, feared him, sometimes both at once. Claire admired him too. Once, in the quiet way someone might admire a distant star, beautiful, unreachable, and unaware of her existence. But admiration had turned to exhaustion over the years. Being invisible took more effort than being seen. She set her cup down, opened her laptop, and began sorting through the day's agenda. Meeting at 9, budget review at 11, investor call at 2. She typed without thinking, her fingers moving from memory. A soft murmur spread across the floor, a signal that Evan had stepped out of his office. Heads tilted subtly. The air shifted. Claire didn't need to look up to know. She could feel his presence like static. Morning, everyone. His voice carried, low and steady. She risked a glance. He was taller than most, shoulders squared beneath a tailored charcoal suit, hair the kind of dark that caught blue under the lights. His expression gave nothing away. He moved through the room as if time bent around his schedule, as if the world existed only to match his pace. He stopped by her desk, eyes on the report she had left the night before. "Carter," he said without looking at her. "This chart fixed the margin alignment. It's off." "Yes, Mr. Cole." He nodded once and walked on. That was their daily choreography. No greeting, no warmth, just a brief intersection of duties. Still, her chest tightened. It shouldn't have mattered, but it did. Every acknowledgement felt like sunlight through thick fog, brief and gone before it reached her skin. At 9:00 sharp, the team gathered in the glass-walled conference room. The hum of conversation fell silent the moment Evan entered. Claire took her usual seat near the end. Notebook open, pen ready. Through the reflection in the window, she caught her own image composed, forgettable. The meeting began with numbers, projections, graphs glowing on the screen. Evan spoke with precision, his tone cutting through the air like fine glass. Every word mattered, every pause carried meaning. "Claire," he said suddenly, not even glancing her way. "The Q3 data, you have the final revenue sheet?" "Yes, sir," she replied, sliding a folder toward him. Their hands almost touched, but he didn't notice. She withdrew her hand quickly. A small movement, invisible to everyone else, but it burned. The discussion turned tense when an analyst misquoted a figure. Claire, without thinking, corrected it softly. "It's actually 12.4%, not 10.8. The room stilled. Evan's gaze lifted, cool and unreadable. "Next time," he said evenly, "wait to be asked." A few quiet chuckles rippled from the table. Claire's stomach tightened. She nodded, her voice faint. "Yes, sir." The meeting moved on. The moment stayed. By the time it ended, she could feel the heat behind her eyes, the way humiliation hums beneath the skin long after the words fade. But she kept her face neutral, packing her notebook carefully as the others filed out. Back at her desk, she opened a spreadsheet she didn't need to check, anything to keep her hands busy. Outside, rain had begun to tap against the glass. Seattle rain, soft, steady, unending. A memory surfaced her first day at the company, standing in this very lobby, full of nervous hope. She had told herself then that hard work would make her seen, that effort would earn respect. She smiled bitterly at the thought. 3 years later, she was still waiting. Sophie appeared beside her, placing a cup of coffee on the desk. "You okay?" she whispered. Claire nodded, forcing a small smile. "I'm fine." The lie tasted like cold sugar. When the clock struck noon, the office lights dimmed slightly, signaling lunch break. People scattered in pairs or small groups. Claire stayed behind, pretending to finish work. The hum of the floor faded until she was alone with the sound of rain and the faint tick of the wall clock. She looked toward the glass door again. Through it, she could see Evan at his desk, leaning over a document, his jaw tense. The light from his desk lamp cast a golden line across the glass, splitting her reflection in two. Something about that image herself divided, transparent, unseen, settled heavy in her chest. Maybe invisibility was safer. Maybe being unseen meant never being hurt. Still, a quiet voice inside her whispered otherwise, a voice she hadn't heard in a long time. Outside, thunder rumbled somewhere over the sound. Claire closed her laptop and exhaled slowly. She didn't know why, but her hands trembled slightly as she gathered her things. Before leaving, she caught one last glimpse of her reflection in the glass door, faint, ghost-like. But there. The rain outside blurred the skyline into watercolor. And for just a moment, she wondered if tomorrow might look different. She didn't know it yet, but someone, somewhere, was about to see her for the very first time. The projector hummed softly as the conference room filled with the low rustle of papers and the faint tapping of pens. Outside, the rain had faded, leaving the windows streaked with silver trails. Inside, the air felt heavy like static before a storm. Claire sat near the end of the long table, her notebook open, pen poised. The quarterly meeting had begun. Evan Cole stood at the head of the table, posture straight, suit immaculate, his expression carved from calm authority. The screen behind him glowed with numbers and graphs, the kind that dictated futures. He didn't look at anyone in particular when he spoke. His gaze moved over the room like a spotlight that never lingered. Revenue is up 12% quarter over quarter, he said, his tone precise. But we're behind projections for the European market. He turned to the charts. We'll need to reassess our expansion timeline. Claire listened, jotting quick notes. Around her, the team murmured agreements, eyes lowered. No one ever interrupted him. No one dared. She checked the figures on her tablet, cross-referencing with the reports she'd compiled. Something caught her attention, a number slightly off. Subtle, but significant. Her stomach tightened. 12% wasn't correct. It was 10.8. A rounding error, maybe, but the kind that could spiral in a financial presentation. For a few seconds, she hesitated. The logical voice in her mind whispered, "Don't." The other voice, the one that still believed accuracy mattered, pushed back. She cleared her throat softly. "Excuse me, Mr. Cole," she said, her voice calm but quiet. "I believe the revenue increase is 10.8%, not 12." The sound of her voice seemed to still the room. Pens stopped tapping, heads turned slightly, almost imperceptibly. Evan's hand froze on the remote. He looked up slowly. The silence stretched, long enough for her heartbeat to become the loudest sound she could hear. Evan's gaze settled on her cold, analytical. The way a surgeon studies a specimen before cutting. "I'm aware of the numbers. Miss Carter," he said evenly. "We round to the nearest integer for presentations. You'll find that standard practice in this company." A faint chuckle from somewhere down the table. Someone shifted in their chair. Claire felt heat rise to her face. She nodded, swallowing hard. "Of course. I just thought—" He cut her off. Voice sharper now. "Next time, think quietly." The words landed like a slap, soft in volume, but loud in humiliation. A pause, the kind that stretches forever. Nobody spoke. A colleague's pen rolled off the table, clattering faintly against the floor. The only sound in the room. Claire's throat burned, but she kept her posture steady. She forced herself to keep writing, though the words blurred on the page. Evan continued as if nothing had happened. "As I was saying, we'll target Q4 adjustments." His tone had returned to its usual calm, his detached rhythm. But something in the air had shifted. Every eye avoided hers now. The quiet sympathy of coworkers, too afraid to show it. She glanced down at her notes. The ink had smudged where her hand trembled. A drop of sweat trickled behind her ear. She pressed her lips together, focusing on the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. Just minutes. Just endure it for a few more minutes. When the meeting finally ended, chairs scraped softly against the floor. People gathered their things quickly, avoiding eye contact. A few offered polite smiles, the kind that said, "I'm sorry, but I'm glad it wasn't me." Claire remained seated, pretending to review her notes until the room emptied. Only when the door closed behind the last person did she let her shoulders drop. She stared at the glossy surface of the table. Her reflection looked warped, stretched by the shine of overhead lights. She almost laughed at the irony invisible for years, and the one time she spoke, she wished she hadn't. From the hallway, muffled footsteps echoed Evan's. Even outside the room, his presence carried a weight that filled every space. Claire's pulse jumped. She stayed perfectly still until the sound faded. Then she exhaled, quietly, like someone who had been holding her breath all morning. Her pen rolled off the table. She watched it spin on the floor, a small, helpless motion, before bending to pick it up. The simple act steadied her somehow. She gathered her folders, stacked them neatly order, at least, she could control. Back at her desk, the open office buzzed again with restrained chatter. No one mentioned the meeting. Sophie glanced up briefly, worry flickering in her eyes, but said nothing. That was the rule here, silence is survival. Claire opened a spreadsheet, pretending to work. Her fingers hovered above the keys, unmoving. The monitor light reflected faintly in her eyes. Inside, a storm gathered not loud, but deep, a mixture of anger and shame, confusion, and something close to grief. It wasn't just the words that hurt. It was the realization that she had expected better, that somewhere deep down, she had still believed he might see her differently. She glanced toward the glass wall of Evan's office. He was on the phone, tone low and steady, back turned to her. From this distance, he could have been anyone, a silhouette carved out of light and glass. Untouchable. Her jaw tightened. She turned back to her screen. Numbers, cells, formulas all safe, impersonal. Time passed quietly. At 5 Azurkar, the office began to thin out. One by one, monitors dimmed, coats slipped on, goodbyes murmured. Claire stayed behind, typing without purpose. She didn't want to step into the elevator yet, not while her chest still burned with unspent words. Finally, when the floor was nearly empty, she closed her laptop. The rain had returned outside, tapping against the windows like restless fingers. She stood, grabbed her coat, and walked toward the exit. As she passed the glass door to Evan's office, she hesitated. Inside, he was still working, head bent over a document. The light from his desk lamp cast a glow across the glass, illuminating her reflection beside his. Two figures divided by a thin, invisible wall. For a heartbeat, she thought he might look up. He didn't. She turned away. The elevator dinged softly. She stepped in, the door sliding shut with a whisper. Her reflection disappeared again, swallowed by brushed steel and fluorescent light. Downstairs, the lobby was nearly empty. A janitor pushed a cart slowly past, the smell of lemon cleaner in the air. Claire paused by the glass doors leading outside. Rain streaked down the city's neon glow, blurring headlights into watercolor trails. She pressed her palm lightly against the cool glass. The city looked vast and unfeeling, but out there, at least, no one knew her as the woman who spoke out of turn. She let the door close behind her, the soft click swallowed by the sound of rain. And somewhere in that quiet walk to her car, something in her heart began to shift, a small, fragile ache turning into a spark of defiance. Tomorrow, she promised herself, would be different. But for now, she just walked, one step at a time, into the rain. The bathroom light flickered once before steadying, its pale glow falling across a row of spotless sinks. Somewhere behind a closed stall, muffled breathing trembled between quiet sobs. Claire sat on the closed lid of the toilet, her hands pressed over her face. The hum of the vent filled the silence like a low, indifferent sigh. She hadn't meant to cry, not here, not over him, but the words kept replaying in her head, sharp and precise. Next time. Think quietly. They echoed until they no longer sounded like his voice, but her own, whispering what she had already believed for years. She reached for a tissue, dabbed at her eyes, and let out a shaky breath. The fluorescent light was merciless. Even tears looked out of place here, too human for corporate walls. She stared down at her shoes, black leather, polished, professional. They looked like they belonged to someone stronger, someone less tired. Minutes passed. She lost count. When she finally stood, her knees cracked softly. She opened the stall door and stepped into the empty restroom. Her reflection stared back from the mirror, pale, blotchy, small. For a long moment, she simply looked, not out of vanity, but disbelief. "When did I shrink this small?" she whispered. The mirror didn't answer. It just offered back the same hollow version of her, one who knew how to be efficient. careful, invisible. She ran cold water over her hands. The shock steadied her heartbeat. Then she smoothed her hair, wiped away the mascara that had bled beneath her lashes, and practiced a smile that didn't tremble. It was the same ritual she'd perfected over the years, a small restoration before stepping back into a world that didn't notice. The office hallway was silent when she emerged. Most lights had dimmed to half brightness, signaling the end of the day. Her computer screen glowed faintly at her desk, the cursor blinking on an unfinished email. She shut it down without reading. For once, she decided not to wait for the clock to reach 5. Her coat hung from the back of her chair, still carrying the faint scent of rain from that morning. She slipped it on and walked toward the elevator, her heels soft against the carpet. No one called after her. No one asked if she was all right. The elevator doors closed around her with a low hiss. The mirrored surface reflected her face in fragments distorted, fading as the floor numbers blinked downward. When she reached the lobby, the sound of rain greeted her again, steady and patient, like an old friend who never asked questions. She stepped outside. The air was cool and damp, carrying that familiar Seattle mix of rain and espresso. Her breath came out in visible puffs. Streetlights reflected off wet pavement, turning every puddle into a piece of shifting gold. She didn't open her umbrella. She wanted to feel it each drop against her skin, washing away the static of the day. Her hair clung to her temples. Her mascara had already surrendered. It didn't matter. Claire walked without direction, following the soft rhythm of her footsteps against the sidewalk. Her mind replayed the day in flashes: the conference room, the laughter, the silence after his words. Every moment pressed down like weight. But under that weight, something else stirred, a faint hum of defiance. A question she hadn't let herself ask before. What if she stopped trying to be small? She crossed an intersection, the light flickering from orange to red behind her. Cars hissed past through the rain. Across the street, a neon sign buzzed faintly, its glow bleeding into the wet air. Lighthouse Books and Cafe. The windows glowed with a warm, amber light. Inside, shelves of books lined the walls, their spines soft with wear. A man stood behind the counter, steaming milk for a latte, the hiss of the wand blending with quiet jazz. A couple laughed softly near the corner table. The sound drifted through the glass like a melody from another life. Claire slowed her steps. She hadn't noticed the cafe before. Maybe she'd passed it 100 times and never looked up. Or maybe tonight, for the first time, she was finally seeing it. Through the fogged window, she saw the faint movement of people reading, writing, existing without hurry. Something about the glow, the smallness of the place, felt like an invitation. For a second, she imagined herself inside, her coat drying on a chair, her hands wrapped around a warm cup, the rain outside becoming just a backdrop. But she didn't go in. Not yet. Instead, she stood beneath the awning, watching droplets collect along the edge before falling into perfect rhythm. The smell of roasted coffee drifted toward her, rich and comforting. She thought of the office, the glass, the silence, the way even her footsteps felt muted there. Then she looked at the cafe again. The contrast made her chest ache. She reached up, brushing away a strand of wet hair from her cheek. Her fingers trembled slightly, but not from cold, from exhaustion. From holding too much in for too long. A soft laugh escaped her lips. Unexpected, fragile. "You're a mess, Claire," she whispered to herself. But in that moment, it wasn't self-loathing. It was almost relief. To admit it. To stop pretending. Rain pooled around her shoes, darkening the concrete. The world outside the office was imperfect, unpredictable, and suddenly, that felt like a gift. She looked down the street. Buses hissed to stops. People hurried beneath umbrellas. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Life kept moving. She inhaled, slow and deep, tasting the city-damp air, coffee, freedom, and when she exhaled, something small and heavy loosened inside her chest. She took one last look at the amber light spilling from the bookstore cafe. Then she turned toward the street and started walking again. Her reflection briefly caught in the wet pavement, a woman still fragile, but finally visible to herself. Behind her, the rain kept falling, soft and steady. The kind of rain that didn't wash things away, but made them grow. And though she didn't know it yet, tonight's walk, this quiet, trembling step away from what had broken her, would lead her somewhere she never expected, toward laughter, toward warmth, toward someone who would finally see her. But for now, she simply walked on, under the rain, and the city breathed with her. The rain had slowed to a whisper by the time Claire found herself standing outside the little bookstore cafe again. The same amber light spilled through its fogged windows, soft and inviting. This time, she didn't just stand there. She pushed the door open. A small bell chimed, warm and round, as if welcoming her back to life. Inside, the air smelled of roasted beans and old paper comforting, human. A soft jazz tune floated through the speakers, a lazy saxophone weaving through piano notes. People talked in hushed tones, pages turned, spoons clinked against ceramic, the kind of quiet that didn't demand anything from her. Claire ordered a cappuccino and found a small corner table by the window. Outside, the world gleamed wet and silver. Inside, she exhaled for what felt like the first time all day. She wrapped her hands around the cup, letting the warmth seep into her skin. Her reflection in the glass looked gentler here, blurred by steam and candlelight. That's when she noticed him. A man sat near the opposite window, sketchbook open, a pencil moving lightly across the page. His sleeves were rolled up to the elbows, forearm dusted with faint charcoal. A few curls of brown hair fell over his forehead. He had the kind of focus that made time slow around him, the same way Evan's focus had once frozen rooms, but softer somehow, quieter. He looked up briefly, eyes catching hers, and smiled. It wasn't a polite smile or a practiced one. It was the kind that reached the eyes a flicker of curiosity and warmth, like someone seeing something worth remembering. Claire blinked, startled, then glanced away quickly, pretending to stir her coffee. Her heart beat faster than it should have for a simple look. A few minutes later, a shadow fell over her table. "Excuse me," a voice said, low, kind. "Would you mind if I sit here? It's the only spot with a decent view of the streetlight. I'm trying to catch the reflection for a sketch." She looked up. It was him, the man from across the room, sketchbook tucked under his arm, smile still lingering. Sure," she said, shifting her cup. "Go ahead." He sat, flipping the book open again. "Thanks. I promise I won't steal your quiet." Claire managed a small smile. "That's fine. I don't own it." He chuckled softly, pencil already moving. "Fair point. I'm Daniel, by the way." "Claire? Nice to meet you." Claire, who doesn't own quiet. Her lips curved before she realized it. "Nice to meet you. Daniel, who sketches streetlights." He looked up, grinning, touché. There was an ease in his presence, unhurried, self-deprecating. The kind of energy that didn't fill the silence, just softened it. She watched him sketch for a moment, curious. His lines were quick but confident, rough outlines that somehow captured light itself. "You're good," she said before she could stop herself. He looked up, a faint smudge of graphite on his thumb. "Oh, thanks. Years of teaching high school art. My students think I'm ancient, but apparently still know how to hold a pencil. You're a teacher." "Yeah. Roosevelt High. 9th and 11th grade." He smiled, glancing at the paper. "What about you?" She hesitated, thinking of the glass walls, the charts, the silence. "I work in an office." He nodded. The mysterious corporate world. I bet you have better coffee than this." She snorted, surprising herself. Worse, much worse. He laughed, a warm, unguarded sound. "Then you've officially earned my sympathy." Something loosened in her chest. It felt strange laughing, like remembering a language she used to speak. Outside. The rain started again, soft against the window pane. Inside, the jazz deepened into something slower. Daniel leaned back in his chair, eyes on her cup. "Do you ever notice," he said, "how rain makes the city smell cleaner, like it rinses away all the pretending?" Claire tilted her head. "That's oddly poetic for a man drawing lampposts." "Art teachers are full of surprises," he replied with mock seriousness. She laughed again, quietly this time. The sound blended with the music, effortless. For the first time in months, maybe years, she didn't feel like fading into the background. He wasn't looking through her or past her. He was looking at her, seeing her, and that realization scared her a little. When their conversation slowed, she sipped her coffee, trying to steady herself. "Do you come here often?" He smirked. "You just asked me the world's most cliché question." Her cheeks warmed. "I did, didn't I? Don't worry," he said, leaning forward slightly. "I'll answer like it's brand new. I come here because the light's good. The barista knows how to spell my name." And his eyes met hers again, softer this time sometimes. "You get lucky with the company." Claire looked down, smiling despite herself. Her fingers traced the rim of her cup. The warmth beneath her skin wasn't just from the coffee anymore. Time passed without her noticing. People came and went. The lights dimmed slightly as the rain outside thickened. Daniel kept sketching, occasionally glancing up to comment on something random, a man in a red scarf, a cat darting between puddles, the way the streetlight flickered like a heartbeat. It was simple, easy, healing. When she finally stood to leave, he closed his sketchbook. "You're heading out." "Yeah," she said softly. "Early morning tomorrow?" He nodded. "Fair. The world's cruel to people who wake up before sunrise." She smiled. "That's me." He looked at her for a moment, thoughtful. "You should let yourself sleep in sometime." Claire shrugged lightly. "Maybe one day." She started for the door. The bell above it jingled as she stepped into the rain. Behind her, Daniel called out, "Hey!" "Claire." She turned. "You dropped something?" He held up a small napkin. On it, a quick sketch her profile, head bent slightly, a faint smile on her lips. Beneath it, he'd written in looping pencil strokes, "For the woman who noticed the rain." Her breath caught. "Keep it," he said, handing it to her. "It's not finished." But then again, good things rarely are. She took it, fingers brushing his for just a second. "Thank you," she murmured. "Any time," he replied, eyes kind. Outside, the rain fell steady, soaking into her coat. She tucked the napkin carefully into her bag and started walking home. The city glowed around her every window, every puddle shimmering like small pieces of light. Somewhere behind her, jazz still played. And for the first time in a very long while, she was smiling, not the practiced kind, but the real one, the kind that begins quietly, almost shyly, and then refuses to fade, because sometimes healing doesn't arrive with thunder or grand gestures. Sometimes it walks in carrying a sketchbook and simply sees you. Mornings began to sound different after that night. No longer the harsh buzz of an alarm echoing in a quiet apartment, but the softer rhythm of routine shared with someone who made silence feel full. Claire would stop by the same corner cafe before work, the one with fogged windows and the smell of cinnamon. Sometimes Daniel was already there, sketchbook open, a cup waiting for her across the table. Still black coffee he'd tease. "You know, living dangerously can start with cream and sugar." She'd smirk. "Maybe next year." He'd pretend to jot that down in his sketchbook. Note, Claire. Possible future risk taker. And she'd laugh that quiet, surprised laugh that had started returning to her voice lately. Days unfolded in small, simple ways. They walked along Lake Union on weekends, the water shifting in ripples of silver under Seattle's soft light. He'd point out reflections and call them liquid sketches. She'd roll her eyes, pretending not to find it poetic. Sometimes she'd talk about her work spreadsheets, deadlines, the invisible pressure of corporate air. Daniel listened like every word mattered, like there was something extraordinary in the ordinary. "You make data sound like art," he said once, handing her a paper cup of chai. "Maybe it is," she replied, surprising herself. "Just very organized art." He grinned. "I knew there was an artist buried in there somewhere." Claire's world began to expand again, not in grand ways, but in colors she had forgotten existed. The gray that had filled her days was replaced with the warmth of shared jokes, late texts about nothing, sketches left tucked into her planner, each one different: her sipping coffee, her walking in the rain, her hands mid-gesture as if caught between thought and movement. At first, she kept them in a drawer, but then she started pinning them on the fridge, a quiet rebellion against her own self-doubt. At work, she noticed herself standing a little taller. Her voice, when she spoke up in meetings, no longer trembled. Even Evan's cold silence didn't cut as deep anymore. When he passed her desk, she met his gaze steady, polite, unafraid. He looked away first. There was something freeing in that. Still. Some nights, when the city quieted and the rain brushed softly against the window, an old fear stirred: the fear of being seen. Not just noticed, but truly seen. Because being seen meant being known, and being known meant being vulnerable again. She'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, Daniel's laughter still echoing faintly in her head. What if I let someone in and it all disappears again? But then she'd remember his voice that day by the lake. "You don't have to prove you're worth seeing, Claire. You already are." And something in her chest would ease. There was one Saturday that stood out: early spring, the kind where the air still held a chill, but the world was trying to bloom anyway. They met at Gasworks Park, Daniel carrying a thermos of coffee and two mismatched mugs. They sat on the grass overlooking the water, seagulls circling overhead, city skyline blurred by light drizzle. He started sketching again, quick strokes, easy confidence. "You draw everything," she said. "Doesn't it get repetitive?" "Never," he said, without looking up. "The trick is to see what's different every time." She watched him, curious. "And what's different about today?" He paused, glancing up. His eyes met hers. "You're smiling without realizing it," she laughed, shaking her head. "You're impossible." "Persistent," he corrected, grinning. "There's a difference." Her laughter faded into quiet contentment. For a while, they just sat, the kind of silence that asked for nothing, the sound of the lake against the shore, the soft hiss of the wind through the grass. Time slowed, not dragging, but resting. Later that evening, she walked home with her shoes damp and her heart strangely light. Her apartment felt less like a place she hid in and more like a place she belonged to. She opened the window, let the city air in, the scent of rain and faint coffee still clinging to her. She looked at the sketch Daniel had given her earlier that day, a rough outline of the lake, two small figures drawn side by side. Below it, he'd written, "Even gray skies can glow." Her fingers brushed the corner of the paper. Something about the line made her throat tighten, not from sadness, but gratitude. For weeks after, her days unfolded in this quiet rhythm: work, laughter, coffee, sketches, the slow rebuilding of self. Each piece of her life started to fit again, but this time with edges softer, kinder. She found herself humming on the walk to the office, buying flowers for her desk, calling her sister back after months of silence. One evening, Daniel joined her on her walk home. They passed under the streetlights, their shadows merging and stretching long across the wet pavement. "You know," he said, "I think you're changing." She smiled. "That sounds dangerous." "No, beautiful." She glanced at him, the city's lights flickering in his eyes. "I don't know if I'm ready for beautiful." He shrugged lightly. "You don't have to be. Beauty doesn't ask for readiness. It just happens." They walked in silence after that, And Claire thought about all the ways her world had been opening again, not with fireworks, but with small moments strung together like fairy lights. A morning smile from the barista, a shared umbrella, a text that simply read, "Made you a sketch today, each one." A gentle reminder that life didn't have to be perfect to feel full. That night, before bed, she stood by the window again. The city lights blinked softly through the mist. Her reflection in the glass looked back the same woman, but somehow different, more color in her cheeks, more life in her eyes. She whispered the thought before it could vanish. "For the first time," she said softly, "I'm looking forward to tomorrow." And she meant it. Outside, the rain began again, not as sorrow, but as music, the rhythm of something growing quietly, somewhere deep within her. The air smelled of lilies and damp soil, warm, rich, alive. Sunlight filtered through panes of old glass, soft and golden, spilling across rows of green leaves that reached toward the light. Somewhere in the corner, water trickled from a small fountain, the sound steady and low, like a heartbeat. Claire stood at the entrance of the greenhouse, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her breath fogged faintly against the humid air. Daniel smiled, stepping beside her. "I thought you'd like it." He looked around, a little sheepish, as if the entire place belonged to someone else and he'd borrowed it for a dream. "It's not much, but, well, the lilies are in bloom. And you once said you loved how they looked in the rain." Claire's lips curved. "You remembered that." He grinned. "I remember everything you say, even when you think I'm not listening." They walked slowly down the narrow path between the plants. The leaves brushed against their sleeves, dew collecting on the fabric, the scent of earth wrapped around them, deep and comforting. Claire's heels clicked lightly against the old brick floor, a rhythm that matched the faint flutter in her chest. Daniel stopped near the center, where the ceiling arched high and light poured in from every angle. The lilies there were taller, fuller white petals open wide like quiet stars. He turned to face her, the sunlight catching on the faint graphite stains that still lingered on his hands. "Claire," he said softly, almost to himself. "Do you remember the first time we met?" She smiled. "You mean when you asked to sit at my table and said it was because of a streetlight?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, worst excuse ever." "It worked," she said. "It did." His smile softened, then faded into something quieter. "You know, I never told you what I was really sketching that night." She tilted her head. "What was it?" "You," he said simply. "I just didn't know it yet." The words landed gently, but they filled the space between them like sunlight, warm, overwhelming, real. He reached into his jacket pocket, fumbling for something, and then took a small step closer. "You changed everything, Claire, the way I see things, the way I see myself. Before you, my world was full of color, but it had no focus. You gave it meaning." Her eyes shimmered, the sound of the fountain blurred. For a heartbeat, she forgot to breathe. Daniel lowered himself to one knee. The motion was unhurried, certain. He opened a small box, and the light caught on the silver band inside, the gem so small it barely reflected, but enough for it to gleam like a drop of morning dew. He looked up at her, eyes steady. "I know life isn't perfect, and I'm not either, but I want to spend the rest of it learning with you, laughing with you, seeing the world through your eyes. Claire Carter, will you marry me?" The world fell into silence. Even the water seemed to pause, waiting. Her hand flew to her mouth. For a second, she couldn't speak. Her vision blurred, not from surprise, but from a rush of something too big, too tender to name. She knelt to meet him, her knees pressing into the cool brick. "Yes," she whispered, voice breaking. "Yes, of course, yes." Daniel let out a soft laugh that was half relief, half joy. His fingers trembled as he slid the ring onto hers. The silver band caught the sunlight and scattered it in tiny reflections, glimmering across the leaves like promises. Claire stared at it, tears slipping down her cheeks. The metal felt light but strong, cool against her skin. She lifted her hand slightly, and the ring flashed again, a small circle of light, her armor of love. Daniel's hand brushed her cheek. "Hey," he said quietly, "don't cry. You're supposed to be smiling right now." "I am." She laughed through the tears. "This is what smiling looks like when you're overwhelmed." He stood and helped her to her feet. For a moment, they just stood there surrounded by the scent of lilies, sunlight bending around them like a blessing. Claire pressed her forehead against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart beneath her ear. Outside, rain began to tap softly against the glass roof, each drop catching light as it fell. The sound blended with their quiet breathing. She closed her eyes. It felt like the world had folded itself into something small and safe, just the two of them. The scent of earth and the sound of rain. After a while, Daniel leaned down, his voice warm against her hair. "I wanted to do this in some fancy restaurant, but it didn't feel right. You belong somewhere that grows." She smiled at that. "So do you." He brushed his thumb across her hand, the silver ring glinting between them. "We'll grow together, then." They walked around the greenhouse a while longer, not speaking much. The rain softened, turning the air hazy with mist. Every few steps, she'd glance down at her hand, still half disbelieving. It wasn't the ring itself that made her heart ache. It was what it meant. That someone had seen her, chosen her, not for her usefulness, not for her silence, but for her heart. When they finally stepped outside, the rain had eased into a fine drizzle. The air felt cool and clean, carrying the scent of wet earth. The sun broke through the clouds, scattering gold across the path. Claire tilted her face toward the light, closing her eyes. Daniel squeezed her hand. "You okay?" She nodded, smiling through the damp strands of hair clinging to her cheeks. "Better than okay." They stood there for a moment, just breathing. The city beyond the greenhouse shimmered faintly through the mist, distant and quiet. For once, she didn't feel small in it. She felt part of it. Daniel leaned closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You know," he said softly, "this place looks like it was made for you." She turned to him. "No," she said, "it was made for this." She held up her hand, the silver catching the light again. "For us." He smiled, and in that smile was the kind of peace she hadn't believed in for years. The rain started again, gentle, like applause. They didn't run for cover, they just stood there, hands intertwined, laughter mixing with raindrops. And as the last bit of sunlight faded behind the clouds, Claire looked down at her ring one more time. It gleamed softly against her skin, fragile, but unbroken, her armor of love. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid to be seen wearing it. Monday morning came wrapped in its usual gray light, Seattle's way of reminding everyone that joy must make its own color. Claire stepped out of the elevator at 7:30, sharp, just as always. But today, everything felt different. The hum of computers, the low murmur of voices, the familiar scent of coffee and paper. It was all the same except for the faint, silver gleam that caught the light as she reached for her desk. Her engagement ring glinted under the cold fluorescence, scattering tiny sparks across the keyboard. The band looked delicate, but the sight of it steadied her somehow, like a quiet promise she could hold in her palm. Claire Sophie's voice broke through the usual Monday stillness. "Oh my God," is that Claire couldn't help the small smile that curved her lips. She lifted her hand slightly, letting the ring catch the light again. Sophie gasped loud enough for half the floor to hear. "No way you're engaged. When did this happen? Saturday?" Claire said softly, the word tasting both strange and beautiful. Sophie squealed, hands over her mouth. "He proposed, I knew it. You've been glowing for weeks. Claire laughed, blushing. The sound felt new in this place, too warm for the sterile air of Cole Innovations. Heads turned from nearby desks, smiles blooming, whispers rippling across the room like a friendly tide. For a moment, the office felt alive. Even the overhead lights seemed less harsh. And then, through the glass wall at the far end of the corridor, movement caught her eye. Evan Cole stood in his office, still as stone, his gaze locked on her. He wasn't supposed to be watching. He never watched anyone. He was the kind of man who saw everything and nothing, at once efficient, detached, unbothered, but now his expression was unreadable, his jaw tense, his eyes fixed, unblinking. Claire's heart stumbled. Sophie followed her gaze, then whispered, "Uh-oh. The boss is staring. Maybe he's not into public celebrations." Claire forced a light laugh. "It's fine," she murmured, though her pulse betrayed her. "He's probably just surprised." But she wasn't sure that was true. Through the glass, Evan didn't move. The light from his office cut sharp lines across his face, half in shadow, half in reflection. For a strange second, the glass between them reminded her of something that first morning, months ago, when she'd thought the door itself was the only thing that noticed her. Now, it felt like the opposite. The glass made her too visible. She turned back to her computer, pretending to adjust her files. Her hand trembled slightly as she set her coffee down. A few minutes passed in a blur of clicking keys and low chatter. She could feel the weight of his stare, even when she wasn't looking. Then came the sound she'd heard 1,000 times, the soft hiss of his office door opening. The air shifted, quiet conversations faltering as his footsteps crossed the floor. Slow, deliberate. "Carter." His voice was calm, but there was something off in it, a pause, a rough edge beneath the usual control. She looked up, blinking. He hesitated, just a second too long. "Carter, he cleared his throat. "Claire, my office. Now." The words hung in the air. A few heads turned. Sophie's eyes widened. It was the first time he had ever said her first name. The sound of it from his lips startled her softer than she expected, like he'd been holding it for a long time and only just realized it belonged to her. Claire nodded slowly, her pulse loud in her ears. "Yes. Mr. Cole." She followed him through the open office, feeling every pair of eyes on her. The glass door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded almost final. Inside, the room smelled faintly of cedar and ink. The blinds were half closed, thin bars of light cutting across the floor. Evan stood near his desk, hands in his pockets, looking at nothing in particular. For a moment, he said nothing. The silence pressed in, heavy and unfamiliar. "Congratulations," he said finally, the word clipped. "Distant. I heard the news." "Thank you," she said carefully. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. He nodded once, still not meeting her eyes. "Daniel Miller, right? The art teacher." The mention of Daniel's name caught her off guard. She hadn't realized Evan remembered. "Yes," she said softly. He turned then, his gaze finding hers. His expression gave nothing away. But his eyes, there was something there. Something tight. Something almost like regret. "Good for you," he said, too quickly. "I'm sure he's a good man." "He is," she replied. Silence again. The air between them felt strange, not cold, but tense, as if both were standing too close to a memory. Evan's fingers drummed lightly against the desk, once, twice, before he stilled them. "You've been performing well these past months," he said finally, his tone shifting back to the familiar, professional rhythm. "I'd like you to take the lead on the Wilcox proposal this week. You'll represent us at the client review." Claire blinked, momentarily thrown. "Me? Yes." He straightened a stack of papers that didn't need straightening. "You've earned it?" Her instinct was to say thank you, but the words caught somewhere between gratitude and confusion. The sudden shift in tone, The warmth that didn't quite fit at all felt like standing on uneven ground. She nodded anyway. "I'll do my best." He looked up again, and for the briefest moment, his gaze softened. "You always do." The quiet after that sentence seemed to stretch longer than the room itself. Claire felt her breath catch. Her hand brushed the edge of the silver band on her finger, a reminder of where she stood, who she was now. Was there anything else she asked finally, her voice gentle but firm? Evan blinked, as if waking from a thought. "No. That's all." She nodded and turned toward the door. As she reached for the handle, his voice came again quieter, almost lost in the hum of the city beyond the windows. "Claire," he said. She paused. "Congratulations," he repeated, softer this time. When she turned, he was looking at the ring the way it caught the faint light, the way her hand trembled slightly as she lowered it. His expression was unreadable, but something in his eyes flickered, something raw, unguarded. "Thank you," she whispered. And then she left. Back at her desk, Sophie was waiting, wide-eyed and buzzing with curiosity. What did he want? Claire smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Work stuff," she said, but her pulse was still uneven. Her name, spoken by him, still lingered in her mind, too human, too intimate for a man who prided himself on distance. Through the glass, she could see him again, standing near his window, one hand braced against the frame, staring out into the gray morning. For a long time, neither of them moved. And then Claire looked back at her screen, the glow reflecting off her ring. The silver shimmered once under the office lights, small, bright, defiant. Outside, the sky hung heavy with rain, the kind that promised a storm. Inside, everything stayed quiet, but something had shifted. The week after Claire's return, something shifted inside the glass walls of Cole Innovations. The rhythm of the office stayed the same, printers humming, phones ringing, keys tapping, yet the air felt sharper, tighter. And at the center of it all was Evan Cole. He wasn't cold anymore. Not exactly. But the chill had turned into something else. Watchful. Controlled. His questions began to come differently now, slower, probing, not just about projects or deadlines, but about her. "How's your weekend?" he asked one Monday morning, his tone casual but his eyes lingering. She blinked, caught off guard. "Good," she said, keeping her voice light. "Quiet." He nodded once, as though testing the word. Quiet can be nice. And then, just like that, he was gone, leaving her pulse uneven behind him. At first, she thought she was imagining it, the longer glances during meetings, the way he lingered near her desk when he didn't have to, the faint edge of curiosity beneath his questions. But it grew harder to ignore. His attention followed her like a shadow that refused to disappear. When he passed her reports, his fingers brushed hers accidentally, perhaps, but too often to be chance. When he spoke to her now, her name came softer, almost hesitant, as though he was still getting used to saying it out loud. "Claire," he said once, stopping by her desk late one afternoon, "do you have a copy of the Q2 breakdown?" She handed him the file, her engagement ring and catching the light between them. His gaze flicked down, just for a moment, before he took the folder. "Thank you," he murmured, voice lower than usual. She nodded, turning back to her computer. But she could feel it, the shift, the awareness that hadn't been there before. Later, in the quiet of his office, Evan tried to focus on the spreadsheets glowing across his monitor, but the numbers blurred. His mind kept drifting back to that morning when she'd walked in, sunlight catching on silver. He could still see the way Sophie had laughed, the way Claire's eyes had sparkled when she said the word engaged. The sound of that word still stung. He'd built his life on discipline, the kind that didn't allow distractions, didn't entertain feelings. But now, every time he caught sight of her hand, of that ring reflecting light like a mirror, something inside him twisted. Jealousy was an emotion he'd always considered beneath him. Primitive, unnecessary. Yet here it was, sharp and relentless, pressing against his ribs. He told himself it wasn't about her, that it was about losing control about something shifting that he hadn't approved, hadn't predicted. But he knew better. He remembered the way she used to avoid his gaze. The way she'd shrink in meetings, waiting for permission to speak. Now she stood taller, brighter. There was laughter in her eyes again. And the worst part, it wasn't because of him, it was because of someone else. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a second. Somewhere below, he could hear her laugh soft, genuine. It cut through him more cleanly than any insult could have. When he opened his eyes again, the city spread beneath the window, gray and endless. His reflection hovered faintly on the glass, pale and unfamiliar. For a moment, he didn't look like the man who'd built this empire. He just looked tired. That evening, as the office emptied, Claire stayed behind, finishing a report. The hum of fluorescent lights was steady above her, her ring flashing softly as she typed. The elevator chimed. Evan stepped out, coat slung over one arm, expression unreadable. "You're still here," he said quietly. She smiled without looking up. "You say that every time?" He hesitated by her desk. Maybe I should stop being surprised. The words were simple, but the tone wasn't. It held something else, something warm, then gone too fast. He cleared his throat. "Don't stay too late." "I won't," she said. But he didn't move. His eyes flicked once more to her hand. The silver band caught the sterile light, and he exhaled through his nose, sharp and quiet. "Good night, Claire." "Good night, Mr. Cole." The door closed behind him with a faint click. Outside, the rain had started again. Through the glass wall of his office, he saw her gather her things, slipping her laptop into her bag. And then, headlights flashed below. A car pulled up to the curb. Daniel. He was leaning casually against the driver's side, one hand raised in a wave. She smiled the kind of smile Evan had never seen directed at him. Real. Effortless. She hurried through the lobby, coat clutched close against the drizzle. When she reached Daniel, he brushed a raindrop from her hair before kissing her forehead. Simple, familiar, as if the world around them didn't exist. Evan stood frozen by the window. The city below moved in slow motion, headlights smearing into gold ribbons on wet asphalt. Claire laughed at something Daniel said, the sound faint through the glass, but unmistakable. Evan's jaw clenched. He didn't realize his hand was gripping the edge of the desk until his knuckles turned white. Jealousy burned quietly. Not wild, but slow, the kind that smolders beneath the surface, refusing to fade. He told himself to look away, but he couldn't. He watched as Daniel opened the passenger door, watched the way Claire's hand rested briefly on his arm, the silver ring glinting under the streetlight before vanishing into shadow. And then they were gone. The taillights disappeared into the rain. For a long moment, Evan just stood there, motionless. The only sound in the room was the faint hum of the air vent and the echo of her name in his mind. Claire. He whispered it once, quietly, testing the sound of it again. It felt like both a confession and a curse. He turned away from the window, walking toward his desk. But the space felt different now, colder, emptier. The walls that had once protected him now felt like a cage. He sat down, elbows on the desk, and pressed a hand against his temple. Somewhere deep inside, something he'd buried long ago was stirring not just jealousy, but regret. He had built a life of control, of distance. But now, watching her walk away, he understood the cost. It wasn't that she was gone, it was that she had never truly been his to lose. Outside, the rain grew heavier, tapping against the windows like unspoken words. He looked up, eyes following the streaks of water sliding down the glass, and for the first time, he wondered what it would feel like to step into the storm instead of watching it from behind the safety of his walls. Down on the street, somewhere in the blur of light and rain. Claire laughed again. And Evan Cole, the man who had everything, realized he'd never been lonelier. The week began with a strange kind of warmth, not from the weather. Seattle stayed gray and cool, as always, but from the way Evan's tone had changed. Subtle, careful, almost kind. It started small, an unexpected thank you during a meeting, a question asked in front of others instead of behind closed doors. But soon, everyone noticed. "Claire," he said one morning, in that calm, deliberate voice of his, "I'd like you to join the strategy session with the Wilcox team tomorrow. I want your perspective." Her pen paused mid-note. He'd never invited her to those meetings before, the ones with the inner circle, the ones where decisions were made, not just executed. "My perspective?" she asked carefully. He nodded. "You have a sharper read on client behavior than most of them do. You see patterns others miss." It was praise, plain and direct, but it landed strangely, like sunlight hitting a window after years of shade too bright, too sudden. Across the table, Sophie shot her a quick grin. Others glanced her way with mild surprise. Claire forced a polite smile, the kind that didn't reveal what was stirring underneath. Inside, something fluttered, part pride, part unease. For the rest of the day, Evan stayed near her workspace more than usual, asking follow-ups, sharing drafts, commenting on phrasing. His tone was measured, his body language professional, yet his presence pressed in constant, heavy, deliberate. By the third meeting that week, she'd begun to sense the pattern. Every time she spoke, he leaned forward slightly. When someone else interrupted, his gaze cut sharp, pulling the focus back to her. "Excellent point, Claire," he'd say, his voice even, his praise precise. "Let's build on that." And the team would nod, scribbling notes. It should have felt good. After years of being invisible, she was finally being seen. But beneath that validation, something else hummed, the faint, unnerving sense that she was being watched, not just acknowledged. That evening, as she packed her things, Sophie appeared beside her. "Wow," she said, grinning. "You and the boss, you're like the new power duo. He's quoting your notes in meetings now." Claire tried to laugh it off. "It's just work." "Maybe," Sophie said, shrugging. "But you've got his attention, that's for sure." Her tone was playful, but the words lingered. His attention. The phrase used to mean nothing to her. Now. It made her pulse quicken for reasons she didn't want to name. Outside, rain misted the glass, blurring the city lights. Claire slipped on her coat, checked her phone, a text from Daniel. "I'm outside. Want your favorite soup tonight?" She smiled and typed back. "Always." When she stepped into the elevator, she felt eyes on her again. Turning slightly, she caught sight of Evan through the glass wall of his office, watching her, not openly, but long enough for her to feel it. The doors closed before she could look away. The next day's strategy session stretched long into the afternoon. The room smelled faintly of coffee and stress, a dozen voices overlapping, charts projected on the far wall. Evan stood at the head of the table, calm as ever, his confidence measured in the stillness of his hands. Halfway through, when an analyst stumbled over a presentation slide, Evan cut in. "Claire," he said, "you handled this part of the forecast last quarter, didn't you?" She nodded. "Yes. Walk us through it," he said. All eyes turned to her. Her throat tightened, but she found her rhythm, explaining the figures clearly, her tone steady. The analyst nodded gratefully, others taking notes. When she finished, Evan gave a small nod of approval. "That's exactly the clarity I was looking for." His words carried the quiet authority that could shift the tone of a room. This time, it worked in her favor. People looked at her differently, not as a background figure, but as someone at the table, someone that mattered. And yet, it felt complicated. After the meeting, he stopped her in the hallway. "You handled yourself well in there," he said. "You've grown." "I see it." "Thank you," she replied. He hesitated, searching her face for a moment too long. I should have said that sooner. Her chest tightened. You just did. Their eyes met, and for the first time, she couldn't read him. Not the usual cool indifference, not even admiration, something heavier, harder to name. The air between them shifted. Evan stepped aside, letting her pass, but his voice followed softly. Good work. Claire. She walked away quickly, the echo of her heels filling the corridor. That night, she told Daniel about the project over dinner. He listened, chin resting on his hand, eyes warm. See, I told you they'd notice your value eventually, he said. You've always been too good at staying quiet. She smiled. Maybe I learned from the best. You make art speak without words. He laughed, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. Yeah, but you make numbers sound like stories. His touch steadied her, grounding her in the calm she knew was real. But somewhere deep down, a question still lingered. Was Evan's recognition genuine, or was it something else? The next morning, she arrived early. The office was still half dark, the city outside wrapped in fog. She brewed coffee, the scent filling the quiet room. Evan's door was open, unusual for him. Papers scattered across his desk, his jacket slung over the chair. He must have worked late. She placed the new reports by his keyboard, careful not to disturb the neat order of things. As she turned to leave, her sleeve brushed a stack of folders. They slid, tumbling across the surface. Damn, she whispered, reaching to gather them. Before she could, a hand appeared beside hers. Evan. He'd come in quietly, his steps muffled by the carpet. His fingers grazed hers as they both reached for the same document. For a second, the world went still. The contact was nothing brief, accidental, but her breath caught his, too. When their eyes met, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition neither wanted, yet couldn't deny. He drew back quickly, the papers forgotten. Sorry, he murmured. It's okay, she said, voice barely above a whisper. The silence that followed wasn't the sterile kind they had shared years before. It hummed quiet, charged, alive. Claire stepped back, the distance between them suddenly feeling smaller than the air could hold. I have a meeting? Of course, he said, his tone steady but his jaw tense. She left, her heart still racing, the faint brush of his hand lingering like static. In his office, Evan stood unmoving, watching the doorway long after she'd gone. He flexed his fingers once, as if trying to erase the memory of her skin against his, but it stayed. So did the thought that followed one he didn't dare say aloud. He had built walls his whole life to stay untouched, but now, one brief, accidental touch had cracked them open, and he didn't know if he wanted to repair them anymore. The ballroom glittered like a dream too polished to be real. Light spilled from chandeliers heavy with crystal, scattering diamonds across the marble floor. The air hummed with polite laughter, the faint clink of glasses, the swell of a string quartet playing something elegant and slow. Claire stood near the edge of the crowd, her fingers tracing the stem of a champagne flute. The gold satin of her dress shimmered each time she moved. She wasn't used to nights like this. Rooms that gleamed, conversations that circled in perfect smiles. Daniel adjusted his tie beside her, grinning. You look like you belong here, he said. She laughed softly. That's generous. I'm mostly trying not to trip. He leaned closer. Still, I bet they're all wondering who you are. Please, she murmured. No one notices the assistant. But someone did. Across the room. Evan Cole watched from a distance, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a glass he'd barely touched. His tuxedo was immaculate black, precise, composed. But his gaze wasn't. It followed her, steady and unreadable. When the music softened, he stepped toward the podium. The murmur of voices ebbed. 100 eyes turned toward him. Good evening, he began, his voice carrying easily through the vast room. Tonight, We celebrate not only our growth, but the people who made it possible. He spoke like a man accustomed to control every pause intentional, every word polished. But as he glanced briefly in Claire's direction, the rhythm faltered. There's one person, he continued, whose insight and diligence have redefined how we operate. Someone who's led with quiet precision. Claire's stomach tightened. He couldn't mean I'm pleased to announce that Claire Carter will be promoted to Associate Director of Client Strategy. A ripple moved through the crowd applause, surprised and sincere. Daniel blinked beside her. Claire, he whispered, smiling. That's incredible. But her heartbeat stuttered. The applause swelled. Evan's eyes found hers through the room, holding just long enough to steal her breath. Daniel clapped, beaming, proud. But something inside her refused to settle. The timing, the public stage, the way Evan said her name like a confession dressed as praise. She smiled, as expected, accepted the congratulations. But she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't about the work. Later, after the applause faded and the music resumed, she slipped out to the terrace. The air was cooler there, salted faintly by the bay. Lights from the harbor blinked through the night like small, distant promises. Daniel followed a minute later, jacket slung over his arm. You okay? She nodded, forcing a smile. Just needed some air. He leaned against the railing beside her. You were brilliant in there. Finally getting the credit you deserve. Her voice was soft. Maybe it just felt sudden. He tilted his head, studying her. You think it's more than that? She hesitated. I don't know. Evan's never been one for surprises or compliments. Daniel's jaw tightened. Right? But suddenly, the man who barely looked at you now promotes you in front of a room full of investors. He let out a low laugh, dry and humorless. That's not about recognition. That's about possession. Daniel? He turned to face her fully now. Does your boss always promote people he ignores? The words landed like a crack in the night. She blinked, caught between defense and disbelief. He's not. Not what his voice softened, but the hurt beneath it didn't. Not interested. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like something's changed. Her chest ached. It's not like that. He's my boss. And you're engaged, Daniel said quietly. To me. The silence stretched thin between them, threaded with the faint sound of music drifting from the ballroom. Claire swallowed hard. You think I don't see it? She whispered. The way he looks at me? Of course I do. But that doesn't mean I didn't say you did, he said, cutting her off gently. But I see the way you look back. That stopped her cold. For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind shifted, brushing her hair across her face. I love you, Daniel said finally, his tone quieter now. I just don't want to watch someone else take pieces of you away while I stand here pretending it's fine. Her throat tightened. I'm not, he shook his head. Maybe you don't even realize it, but he's not just your boss anymore. He's a part of your thoughts, the part you don't talk about. The words cut deeper because they were true. Claire looked out at the water, her reflection shivering in the glass. Daniel, she said softly, you're the one who found me when I'd forgotten how to be seen. He gave a sad smile. And maybe that's why it hurts, because I know what it's like to be invisible. The terrace lights flickered as the wind rose. Inside, laughter swelled, oblivious. Evan appeared in the doorway then, framed by gold light. Claire, he called, voice even but low. They'd like you to say a few words. Her head turned sharply. Daniel's hand dropped from hers. Evan's gaze shifted briefly between them, catching something unspoken in the air. His expression didn't change, but his jaw did a flicker of tension. Quickly hidden, I'll be there in a moment, Claire said. He nodded once and stepped back inside. The door closed softly behind him, leaving only the echo of music and the pulse in her ears. Daniel exhaled slowly. Of course. He needs you now. Daniel? He gave her a small, tired smile. Go. It's your night. Remember? When she turned to face him, his eyes had softened again, wounded but kind. Just don't let him make it his. She nodded, heart heavy. Then she turned toward the ballroom. As she stepped back into the golden light, applause rose again. Evan stood at the edge of the crowd, his gaze steady, a faint curve at his mouth that didn't quite reach his eyes. She joined him on stage, every step echoing louder than it should. He handed her the microphone, their fingers brushing. Just a second brief, electric, but enough to steal the air from her lungs. Congratulations, he murmured. Her voice trembled. Thank you. The crowd watched, smiling, unaware of the storm that brewed in the space between them, and when she turned to address the room, her reflection in the crystal chandelier above shimmered one woman, two worlds. The applause drowned the ache, but as the music swelled again, she felt Daniel's absence from the edge of the room and Evan's presence beside her, heavy as gravity. Her hand tightened around the microphone. The silver ring caught the light still shining, still hers, but for the first time. It felt like it was trying to remind her who she was, and for the first time, she wasn't sure she remembered. The city was still half asleep when Claire arrived at the office. The sky hung pale and colorless beyond the glass. That gray hour before morning decides to wake. The conference room was empty, its long table reflecting the skyline like a muted mirror. She set her coffee down, the steam curling upward, soft against the cold air. Her hands were steady, but her chest wasn't. She'd barely slept. The gala, Daniel's words, Evan's eyes, they had followed her into every dream, every breath. The door opened behind her. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. His footsteps were slow, deliberate, each one pulling the silence tighter around them. Claire, Evan said quietly. She exhaled through her nose, eyes still on the window. You're early. So are you. He stopped a few feet away. The sound of the city began to rise faintly. Cars, sirens, the pulse of another ordinary day. But inside that room, time felt suspended. I wanted to talk to you, he said. She turned then, meeting his gaze. His tie was loosened, his expression unreadable, yet there was something raw around the edges, like a man who'd rehearsed his composure and failed. About what she asked, voice calm, though her heart was a drum. He hesitated. Last night, her stomach knotted. If this is about the promotion, you didn't need to. It's not about the promotion. The interruption was quiet but sharp. He took a slow breath, eyes lowering for a moment before finding hers again. It's about you. The room seemed to shrink. Her voice came out softer. Evan. He stepped closer, just enough for her to feel the heat of his presence. I've been trying to ignore this, he said, for months, maybe longer. I told myself it was nothing. Professional respect, curiosity, but it's not. Her pulse stuttered. Stop. I can't, he said, the words breaking through restraint. I've tried to stay in control. I built my entire life around it. But every time I see you, He stopped, running a hand through his hair, the gesture uncharacteristically human. I lose it. She took a step back, the glass of the window cool against her spine. You shouldn't be saying this. I know, he said. His voice lowered. Rough now. But I can't keep pretending. I've admired you since before I even realized it. The way you think, the way you hold yourself, even when people overlook you. When I humiliated you that day, I saw the look in your eyes, and it haunted me. I hated that I'd become the kind of man who could make someone like you feel small. Claire swallowed hard. You did, she whispered. He nodded once, the motion sharp. I know, and I can't undo it. But every day since then, I've wanted to make it right. She stared at him, the truth heavy between them. You don't get to do this now, she said quietly. You don't get to say all this after everything. His voice softened. You think I planned it? You think I wanted to fall in love with you? The words landed like a crack in the air. Claire froze. Evan's eyes were steady, the confession bare and unguarded. I fought it, he said. God, I fought it, but I can't anymore. I see you, Claire. I see everything I didn't before. She shook her head, tears stinging her throat. You can't say that. Why not? Because I'm engaged. Evan, she said, her voice breaking, because you don't love me. You love the version of me that fits your guilt. You love the woman who finally stopped being invisible to you. He flinched, but didn't step back. No, he said. That's not true. Isn't it? She asked, eyes fierce through the shimmer of tears. You ignored me for years. And now, suddenly, I matter because someone else saw me first. He stared at her, pain flickering in his expression. You think this is jealousy. I know it is. He exhaled, the sound low, defeated. Maybe it started that way, but it's not just that anymore. He moved closer again, slow enough for her to step away, but she didn't. His voice dropped to a whisper. Do you know what it's like to wake up and realize the one person you've overlooked is the only one who's ever really known you? Claire's chest rose and fell, quick and shallow. You don't know me? He shook his head. I do. I know the way you read every room before speaking, the way you hide your ideas behind other people's voices, the way you breathe when you're angry but don't want to show it. I know because I've watched it all. I just didn't have the courage to admit why. She closed her eyes. His words were too much, too intimate, too real. When she spoke, her voice trembled. Do you hear yourself? You're saying all this now, after I've built something, after I've finally found peace. Why now? Because peace is easy when it doesn't hurt, he said softly. And I've never been more afraid of losing something than I am right now. The silence that followed was thin and trembling. She could hear his breath, uneven. Don't, she whispered. I have to, he said, because if I don't say it, I'll regret it for the rest of my life. Her hands shook. She didn't know if it was anger, heartbreak, or something else. I can't give you what you want, she said. I don't want anything, he replied. Not a choice, not a promise. I just needed you to know, to understand why I've been the way I've been. Her eyes met his, glassy and raw. You think this makes things easier? It doesn't. You've made everything harder. I know, he said, voice low, but I'd rather live with the truth than keep hiding behind silence. The city light shifted through the windows, streaking his face with gold and gray. He looked like a man unraveling quietly, and she hated that a part of her wanted to reach for him. Please, she whispered, don't look at me like that. Like what? Like I'm something you've just discovered, she said, her voice shaking. I'm not new. Evan, I was here all along. He nodded, eyes closing briefly. I know, and I was too blind to see it. For a moment, neither moved. The sound of the clock filled the air small, steady, merciless. Finally, Claire turned, reaching for the door. Her hand rested on the handle, but she didn't push. You've said what you needed to say, she murmured. Now let me breathe. Her voice was quiet, but it trembled with everything she didn't say. He didn't stop her. He only whispered, I'm sorry. She walked out without looking back. The door closed softly behind her, leaving Evan alone with the morning light. He stood there for a long time, staring at the empty chair she'd left behind, the faint warmth of her presence still clinging to the room. Outside, the skyline glowed. The city was awake now, the world moving on. But for him, time stayed still. He pressed his palm against the cool glass of the window, his reflection fractured by light. And in the quiet that followed, he said her name once, just once, as if it were both confession and prayer. Claire. Rain pressed softly against the window. a steady rhythm that filled the silence of her apartment. The city lights blurred through the glass gold and gray bleeding together like watercolor. Claire sat at her small desk, a journal open before her, pen motionless in her hand. The lamp cast a warm, uneven circle of light across the page, while everything beyond it remained shadowed and still. She exhaled slowly. The day had been long, but the weight in her chest wasn't from exhaustion. It was from his words still echoing in the back of her mind. "I've admired you since before I even realized it. I love you." She squeezed her eyes shut, the memory hitting her again, sharp and unwanted. For a moment, she just listened to the rain. Each drop seemed to speak in its own quiet language, falling steady, relentless, like her thoughts. Finally, she picked up the pen. The nib hovered over the paper, trembling slightly before she began to write. "I should hate him." The words looked harsh in ink, too certain, too clean. She set the pen down and let the truth unravel in her head instead. She didn't hate him. She hated that she couldn't. Daniel's name came to her next gentle grounding. She thought of his laugh, the way he said her name as though it was something worth protecting. She remembered his hands, always warm, always steady. The way he'd found her when she was small and afraid, when all she wanted was to disappear. He had given her peace. And yet, peace and stillness were not always the same thing. Her reflection wavered faintly in the window. The city's pulse beat softly behind her, and somewhere between the hum of traffic and the whisper of rain, she felt the truth rise something deeper, darker, harder to name. "Do I want peace?" she thought, "or passion?" The question slipped from her lips before she could stop it, the sound barely louder than the rain. She leaned back in her chair, her breath uneven. The word passion felt dangerous. It didn't belong to her. Not really. It belonged to someone else, to the man who looked at her as though he'd spent years pretending he couldn't. She thought of the moment in the conference room, the way his voice had cracked, the way he'd said her name Claire like it was something fragile. It should have made her angry. It did, partly, but underneath that anger, something else trembled. Something that had been buried since the day he first cut her down in front of everyone. She remembered the sharp sting of humiliation, the heat on her face, the weight of silence afterward, how small she had felt, how invisible. And now, he saw her. The cruel irony of it made her laugh under her breath, short and bitter. "You see me now?" she whispered to the empty room. Too late. The pen rolled against the paper. She caught it absently, her thumb brushing the cool metal. She wanted to write again, but didn't know what to say. Instead, she let the memories shift Daniel's soft voice at dinner, the way he brushed her hand when he passed her coffee, his quiet steadiness. Then Evan's clipped words, long silences, the way he said little but somehow made the air around him heavy with meaning. Two men, two kinds of gravity. Her heart moved between them like a pendulum, pulled one way, then the other. She pushed the journal aside, resting her forehead against her folded arms. The rain outside thickened, drumming against the glass in waves. For a long moment, she just stayed there, breathing in rhythm with it steady, relentless, the sound of everything she couldn't quiet. "You don't get to say this now," she had told him. But part of her knew that he hadn't said it to get her back. He'd said it because it was breaking him not to, and it was breaking her to hear it. She stood and walked to the window. The glass was cool beneath her fingertips. Across the street, a neon sign flickered a small bookstore cafe, the same one where she had first met Daniel. The memory made her chest ache. She saw herself there, months ago, small and hesitant, sitting across from a man who made her laugh without trying, a man who didn't make her question her worth. And yet tonight, her heart wasn't laughing. It was listening to rain, to memory, to a voice she'd told herself she didn't want to hear again. Do I want peace or passion? The question repeated itself, steady as the rain. Peace was Daniel's hand in hers, warm, constant, kind. Passion was Evan's voice breaking through restraint, wild, uncertain, alive. She closed her eyes, shame cutting through the longing. What kind of woman stood between two worlds, one safe, one burning? But maybe it wasn't about the men at all. Maybe it was about her. The version of herself she had learned to silence, the one who wanted to feel instead of just survive. She pressed her palm against her heart, her breathing shallow. "What do I want?" she whispered into the dark. Outside, thunder rolled low over the city, a sound that felt like an answer, deep, unresolved. She returned to the desk and opened her journal again. The last line she'd written stared back at her. "I should hate him." Beneath it, she wrote instead, "But I don't. I wish I did." Ink bled softly into the paper. She watched it spread, the way rain spreads across glass, slow, certain, impossible to stop. The clock on the wall ticked quietly. Midnight passed unnoticed. She leaned back, closing her eyes, listening to the rain again. It was everywhere, on rooftops, on windows, on the street below. A sound without beginning or end, and in that endless sound, she found herself thinking not of love, not of guilt, but of something simpler, a quiet understanding that sometimes the heart doesn't choose what's right, it chooses what's alive. Her breath caught. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to cry. Not the sharp tears of heartbreak, but the slow, heavy kind that cleanse. When the tears stopped, the rain still hadn't. It beat steady against the window, the rhythm matching her pulse. Claire looked down at her ring silver, gleaming faintly in the lamplight. It was beautiful, solid. But as she turned it between her fingers, she saw something she hadn't before: the faint reflection of her own face, blurred by the curve of the metal. She smiled through the ache. "You've always been a mirror," she whispered. "Maybe that's the problem." She slipped the ring back into place, not as a promise, but as a pause. The storm outside showed no sign of ending. It moved through the night with quiet purpose, washing the city clean, even if the people inside it weren't ready to be. Claire blew out the lamp. The room fell into darkness, but she didn't move from her seat. She stayed there, listening to rain, to her breath, to the chaos inside her that somehow felt like truth. And when she finally whispered into the dark, her voice was barely there, soft as the rain itself. "I don't know what I want anymore." The storm answered her in silence. The restaurant was small, quiet, tucked between two brick buildings on a narrow street lined with flickering lamps. Rain glistened on the pavement outside, soft and silver, the kind of rain that seemed to belong to goodbyes. Claire sat by the window, hands folded around a glass of water she hadn't touched. Candlelight danced against her reflection, and for a moment she barely recognized the woman staring back. Daniel arrived a few minutes late, as he always did, breath misting from the cold. He smiled when he saw her, that same familiar, open smile that had once steadied her. "Hey," he said, his voice gentle. "You look beautiful." She smiled back. "Hi, Daniel?" He shrugged out of his coat and slid into the seat across from her. The space between them felt smaller than before, but heavier somehow. For a while, they talked like they used to about work, the rain, a film they both wanted to see. Their laughter was soft, polite, careful. Every word was a step around the truth neither of them had spoken yet. When the waiter came, she ordered tea. He ordered wine. And then the silence settled in, long enough to be noticed. Claire looked down at her hands. Her ring caught the light, a clean silver arc. She turned it once, slowly, around her finger. "Daniel," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked up immediately, eyes searching hers. "What is it?" She took a breath. "You know when you've been walking in the dark for so long, and someone hands you a light?" He frowned slightly, not yet understanding. "That's what you were to me," she said softly. "You found me when I was lost. You made me feel safe again." His eyes softened. "Claire." She shook her head gently. "Please, let me say this." He nodded, the faintest movement. "I thought that was love," she said, and maybe it was. A kind of love that heals, that steadies you. But lately, I've realized something. She paused, her throat tightening. You saved me, Daniel. But now, I need to find myself. The words fell like rain, quiet, inevitable. He didn't answer right away. His jaw tightened, then released. And when he spoke, his voice was low, fragile. You're leaving me. She blinked hard. I don't want to hurt you. He gave a small, broken laugh. That's the thing about love, isn't it? It hurts even when no one means to. For a moment, neither moved. The candle between them flickered, caught in the draft from the door. Claire reached across the table and took his hand. His fingers were warm, familiar. She could feel the tremor in them. I thought I could spend the rest of my life being grateful, she said quietly. But that's not the same as being alive. His eyes shimmered. Is it him? She looked down. It's not about him. It's about me. About who I've become when I stopped hiding. He exhaled, slow and deep, his thumb brushing against her knuckles. I should be angry, he said, but I'm not. I just wish I'd been the one to wake that part of you up. Tears slipped from her eyes before she could stop them. You did. You just didn't know it. The waiter passed by quietly, pretending not to see. The world outside continued, cars passing, laughter from the street, but inside, time seemed to slow. Daniel leaned back, his shoulders sinking. So, this is it, he said softly. She nodded. I think it has to be. He tried to smile, but it faltered halfway. I don't regret a second, he said. Even now, her heart broke a little more. Neither do I. They sat like that, two people who had once been everything to each other, now learning how to let go with grace. After a long pause, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He set it on the table, between them, not opening it. I was going to give this back, he said quietly, but maybe it's better if you do. Her breath caught. She slipped the ring from her finger slow, trembling, and laid it gently in the box. The faint click as it closed was almost too soft to hear, but it echoed in both their chests. Sound cue, a quiet, silver finality. He stared at the box for a moment, then looked at her. Do you love him? She hesitated. I don't know what I feel yet. I just know I can't lie to you. He nodded. That's enough. Her tears came again, not sharp, but slow, steady, like the rain outside. Daniel stood, walked around the table, and knelt beside her chair. For a second, she couldn't breathe. Then he took her hand one last time. You don't owe me forever, he whispered. Just the truth, and you already gave me that. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his. I'll always be grateful, she said, voice shaking. I know. He kissed her cheek soft, lingering, and stood. Goodbye. Claire. She watched him leave, the bell above the door chiming faintly as he stepped into the rain. For a while, she didn't move. Her hand rested where his had been, still warm. Outside, the night-blurred streetlights glowing through the drizzle, their reflections rippling across the wet pavement. She looked down at the empty space on her finger. It felt strange, lighter, not freedom exactly, but the beginning of something she didn't yet understand. The waiter came by with the check, hesitating when he saw her tears. Take your time, he murmured. Claire smiled faintly. I already did. When she finally stood to leave, she slipped the box into her coat pocket. It was small, but its weight felt enormous. She stepped outside. The rain met her gently, soaking through her hair, cooling her flushed skin. The city glowed around her reflections, moving like ghosts across puddles and glass. She started walking, no umbrella, no direction in mind. The rain clung to her like memory. Each step forward felt both wrong and right. She paused at the corner, under a street lamp, and tilted her face to the sky. The water kissed her eyelids, her cheeks, her lips a baptism of sorts. And as she stood there, heart breaking quietly in the open air, she whispered the truth that had been waiting all along. "Thank you, Daniel." Then, softer still, as if speaking to no one and everyone, "Now, I need to learn how to love myself." The rain answered with silence, and she walked on, into the night, the sound of her steps fading beneath the steady rhythm of falling water. The morning after she called off the wedding, the air in Claire's apartment felt strangely still, not empty, but expectant, like the moment before sunlight reaches the windows. The box with the ring sat on her kitchen counter, untouched, a reminder, but no longer a wound, just a pause between lives. She stood barefoot by the window, mug of coffee in hand, watching the soft drizzle trace lines down the glass. Seattle's sky was its usual gray, but to her, it looked different, not heavy anymore, just quiet. For the first time in months, she wasn't waiting for someone to arrive, or call, or decide for her. It was just her, and somehow, that felt enough. The apartment, small but warm, looked tired, like it had been holding its breath through every heartbreak. The walls still carried shadows from the life she thought she'd have: a framed photo of her and Daniel at Pike Place, a half-finished painting he'd given her on her last birthday, a list of wedding to-dos stuck to the fridge with a crooked magnet. One by one, she began to take them down, not out of anger, but as an act of release. The picture frame went into a drawer, the list into the trash, the painting she kept. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about color, the soft blues and greens that still made her feel calm. By noon, the floor was covered in dust and cardboard boxes. She opened the windows wide despite the chill. Air rushed in, damp and cool, smelling faintly of rain and asphalt. The curtains fluttered like wings. A small act, but it changed the room. Light began to stretch across the hardwood floor, catching on the small brass edges of her bookshelf, the rim of her coffee cup, the silver frame of her mirror. For the first time in a long while, the apartment breathed with her. She dragged an old rug to the center, rearranged furniture, placed a plant by the sill, a pothos, its vines soft and curling toward the light. She'd never been good at keeping plants alive before, but maybe she was ready now. Every corner she touched, every small adjustment, felt like a quiet promise. "This is mine." When her phone buzzed, she didn't look right away. She knew the rhythm of that sound, even muted. It carried his name, Evan. She let it ring once, twice. Then, on the third buzz, she picked it up. Claire. His voice was steady, lower than usual. "I heard about the engagement." Her hand tightened around the phone. "You heard right. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry," he said. "Not for what I said that day. I meant that. But for how much it's cost you." She leaned against the counter, eyes closed. "Don't apologize. Evan, this isn't about you." He hesitated. "If you need anything, I don't," she said gently, cutting him off before the words could turn into a lifeline she didn't want. "I mean, thank you, but I need to do this part on my own." A silence followed, not awkward, but weighted. He seemed to understand, even if he didn't like it. "Claire," he said finally, his voice quieter now, "you've always been stronger than anyone gave you credit for, including me." She smiled faintly. "Took you long enough to notice." He let out a soft laugh, the sound faint and almost tender. "I'll see you at work." When the call ended, she stood still for a moment, the quiet filling back in around her. The words lingered, not romantic, not possessive, just respectful. It was enough. She turned back to the open space and began again. In the afternoon, she made tea and sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by sketches, notes, and dreams she'd once tucked away for someday. Someday had always depended on someone else, a manager's approval, a partner's encouragement, a perfect moment that never came. But what if someday was just now? She opened her laptop and began typing ideas for a project proposal, a plan to expand mentorship for women in tech, a quiet ambition that had lived in the corner of her heart since her first day at Cole Innovations. She worked until her eyes blurred, stopping only when she realized the light outside had shifted to gold. Evening, the rain had stopped. The city beyond the window glowed traffic lights, neon signs, the faint hum of life returning after the storm. She stretched, then walked to the kitchen. Her tea had gone cold, but she didn't mind. She poured it out, filled her glass with water, and stood by the sink, breathing. The silence wasn't lonely anymore. It was hers. That night. She lit a candle on the coffee table, the flame soft and flickering. She sat nearby, wrapped in a blanket, notebook in her lap. She didn't write about love, or loss, or him. She wrote about light, about the way it always finds its way back, even through clouds, even through glass, and about how maybe she was learning to do the same. When she finished, she set down the pen and looked around her apartment. It wasn't perfect. The rug was slightly crooked, the paint chipped in places, the bookshelf leaning a little to one side, but it was alive. She whispered, almost to herself, "It's enough." The words hung in the air, fragile and true. Later, when the night deepened, she turned off every light except the one by her bed. Her reflection caught in the mirror, hair loose, face bare, eyes tired but open. For once, she didn't look past it. She looked into it. The woman staring back wasn't waiting anymore. Not for love, not for forgiveness, not for permission, just for the next morning. And as she pulled the blanket close and lay down, the city outside hummed its quiet lullaby, a song of engines, rain gutters, and soft, unseen beginnings. The window was still open. The air moved gently through the room, brushing against her skin. In that stillness, she thought of how strange it was that letting go could feel so much like coming home. And when she finally closed her eyes, there was no ache, no fear, just a simple, steady truth. For the first time in her life, Claire wasn't choosing someone else. She was choosing herself. Spring came late that year, the kind that sneaks in quietly, not with blossoms or sunshine, but with longer mornings and softer air. The city thawed slowly. So did she. Claire sat by the window of the office cafe, fingers wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone lukewarm. Across the glass wall, the team buzzed, keyboards clicking, printers humming, someone laughing too loudly near the copier. The world had gone on, as it always did, and so had she. It had been 3 months since she ended things with Daniel, 3 months since she'd stopped waiting for the next heartbreak, 3 months since she decided to begin again, one small act at a time. Evan passed by the cafe, briefcase in hand, phone at his ear. He caught sight of her, hesitated, then gestured toward the chair across from her. A quiet question. She nodded. He ended the call, slipped into the seat. "You're here early," he said. "So are you," she replied, a half-smile tugging at her lips. "I could say I'm setting an example," he said, smirking slightly, "or avoiding traffic." He chuckled. "Maybe both. It wasn't like before, not the charged silence, not the tension hanging thick between them. This was lighter, human." He looked around, noticed the plant on her desk near the window. "That new yeah," she said. "I'm trying to keep something alive for once." He smiled, almost tenderly. "It suits you." The green. Her cheeks warmed. She looked away, pretending to check her emails. Their conversations had become like this small, harmless exchanges that carried the weight of something deeper. They didn't talk about that morning in the conference room, or the words he'd said that neither could take back. Instead, they built something different, something quieter. A few days later, he started dropping by her office during breaks, sometimes with questions about a project, sometimes with coffee, sometimes with nothing at all. She didn't ask why. She didn't stop him either. Bit by bit, the air between them shifted. At first, it was awkward, the cautious politeness of two people who had hurt each other and were learning how to exist again without the sharp edges. But slowly, that politeness turned into comfort. They found small moments to laugh again. Once, she caught him trying to fix the jammed copier, sleeves rolled up, expression deadly serious. When it suddenly spat out 30 copies of an old memo, she burst into laughter. He looked up, mock offended. "You're enjoying this too much. Completely," she said, grinning. He sighed, but his lips curved. "You could help. You know." "I could," she said, still laughing. "But I won't." Even Sophie noticed the change. "You two seem less murdery lately," she whispered one afternoon, handing Claire a folder. Claire rolled her eyes but couldn't help smiling. "We're learning to speak in full sentences now." "Progress," Sophie said, raising an eyebrow. "Should I start planning the office wedding? Or, Sophie, okay?" "Okay." She laughed, backing away. "But if he ever brings you coffee and a muffin, I'm calling it." Claire shook her head, but the warmth in her chest lingered long after Sophie left. The real test came one Thursday afternoon, when Evan asked if she'd like to join a small strategy meeting, not because she was assigned, but because he valued her perspective. That word valued stayed with her. During the meeting, he didn't interrupt her, didn't speak over her. When she offered an idea, he leaned forward, listening, nodding, and when the team voted to implement it, he gave her credit, publicly, afterward. As they left the conference room, she said softly, "You didn't have to do that." He looked at her, genuinely confused. Make it sound like it was my win." "It was your win, Claire," he said simply. "You earned it." It was such a small exchange, but something inside her shifted a thread of old hurt quietly mending. Weeks passed like the long hours, small victories, conversations that wandered from work to weather to music. Trust wasn't rebuilt in grand gestures. It grew in the silence between them, the pauses that no longer felt fragile. Then came the day he met Sophie. It happened in the break room, the collision of two strong-willed personalities. "So, you're the infamous Evan Cole," Sophie said, crossing her arms. "The man who used to terrify interns and now buys my boss lattes." He blinked. "Infamous." "She's exaggerating," Claire interjected quickly. "Am I?" Sophie said, smiling too sweetly. "I just find it fascinating, the way power dynamics evolve." Evan's lips twitched. "You must be Sophie, the one and only." They stared at each other for a beat then, unexpectedly. Both laughed. Claire sighed, half amused, half mortified. "This is not how I wanted you two to meet." Sophie winked. "Oh, I think it's perfect." After that, the office buzzed with subtle humor again. Evan became less of a legend and more of a person. He still carried authority, but it no longer came with ice in his tone. Sometimes, Claire caught herself watching him, not with longing, but with quiet understanding. He was trying too, in his own way, to be better, to meet her where she was, not where she had been. One Friday evening, they stayed late finishing a report. The office had emptied, and the city lights shimmered beyond the glass walls. He leaned back in his chair, stretching, groaning softly. "Remind me why we do this to ourselves." "Because you love control," she teased. He smirked. "And you love being right." "True." They both laughed. The sound filled the room light, effortless. When the laughter faded, he looked at her, something unspoken flickering in his gaze. "You've changed," he said. "So have you." He nodded slowly. "Maybe we both needed to." She smiled. Maybe. A pause. The kind that used to be heavy. Now, it was comfortable. He glanced at her coffee mug chipped at the rim. Faint lipstick stain on the edge. "You still drink it? Black old habits die hard." He smiled. "Not all old habits are bad." She tilted her head, curious. "You sure about that?" He met her eyes. "I'm trying to be." Outside, rain began to fall again, soft against the windows. They didn't speak after that. They didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer a wall. It was a bridge steady, slow, real, and as she packed her bag and turned off her monitor, she glanced back once more. He was still there, sorting papers, humming softly under his breath, unaware she was watching. It wasn't love yet, not quite, but it was something stronger than before. Trust, rebuilt one small moment at a time. She smiled to herself, the kind of smile that held no rush, no expectation, just peace, and maybe the quiet hope of beginning again. Morning coffee. The launch event was held in a renovated warehouse near the harbor glass walls. Open beams, soft golden light pouring through from the rising sun. It had been a year since everything had changed. A year since endings had quietly turned into beginnings. Claire stood near the window, watching the first guests arrive. The hum of quiet conversation filled the room, warm and alive. Tables lined with displays showcased local startups, women-owned ventures from around Seattle, their stories printed in soft lettering beside handmade crafts, sustainable products, art, and code. This was her project. The one she had built with Evan, a joint initiative between Coal Innovations and the city, funding mentorship programs for women entrepreneurs. It wasn't about redemption anymore. It was about creating something that mattered, something she wished had existed when she was too afraid to speak up. Sophie waved from across the room, clipboard in hand, multitasking with her usual grace and chaos. 5 minutes until you're on stage, she mouthed, flashing a grin. Claire smiled, her heart steady. Public speaking had once terrified her, but now it felt different. The nerves had turned into purpose. She turned slightly and saw him. Evan stood near the entrance, talking with the mayor, his expression calm, focused. He had changed to less armor, more light. The sharpness that once defined him had softened at the edges, though the quiet intensity in his eyes was still there. When he caught her looking, he gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, but she felt it like a pulse. The music faded. She stepped onto the stage. The room quieted. "Good morning," she began, her voice clear, grounded. "When we first started this project, it wasn't about innovation or technology. It was about voices, the ones that go unheard too often, and the courage it takes to speak when no one's listening." She paused, letting the silence breathe. "I used to be one of those voices," she continued softly, "invisible in the noise. But someone once told me that being seen isn't the same as being known. I think being known starts when you finally see yourself." Her words hung gently in the air. She finished her short speech to warm applause, stepping down as the crowd erupted into conversation again. Sophie threw her a proud thumbs up from the back. Evan met her near the edge of the stage, handing her a glass of sparkling water. "You did great," he said. She smiled. "I didn't faint. I'll take that as a win." He chuckled. "You were more than fine." They walked together toward the large windows, the city beyond them waking up in shades of pink and gold. That's when she saw him, Daniel. He stood near one of the vendor tables, talking animatedly with a young woman about design software. He looked good lighter somehow, his confidence easy, not forced. When his eyes met hers, his smile was warm, no ghosts, no pain, just peace. He crossed the room, and when he reached her, he extended his hand. "Claire Carter," he said with a teasing grin. "You're kind of a big deal now." She laughed, taking his hand. "I wouldn't go that far." "Then I will," he said, eyes kind. "I'm proud of you." "Thank you, Daniel. That means a lot." He nodded. "Guess this is what we both needed." "Huh. A little time? A little distance?" "Maybe," she said softly. "Maybe it was exactly what we needed." He glanced at Evan, standing quietly beside her, then back at her again. "Looks like you two figured out how to work together without destroying each other." Evan smiled faintly. "We're a work in progress." Daniel laughed. "Aren't we all?" They shared an easy silence, not awkward, not heavy, just full of things that had already been forgiven. Anyway, Daniel said, adjusting the strap of his bag, I'm opening my own gallery downtown next month. You both should come by. No pressure. We will, Claire said. And she meant it. He nodded once more, gave her a gentle, knowing look, and disappeared back into the crowd. Evan turned to her. You okay? Yeah, she said. I really am. They stood side by side, watching as the event continued. Laughter, handshakes, camera flashes. The warehouse buzzed with possibility, with the kind of hope that felt earned. After the crowd thinned, Claire and Evan slipped outside for air. The dock stretched out before them, the water still and glassy under the early light. Gulls drifted overhead, their cries soft and distant. Evan leaned against the railing, looking out over the sound. Do you ever think about how much can change in a year? She smiled. All the time. He glanced at her. Do you regret any of it? She shook her head slowly. No. I think everything had to happen exactly the way it did. He was quiet for a moment, then said softly, You know, I used to think power meant control, but watching you build this, watching you stand there today, it made me realize I was wrong. Power isn't control, it's courage. She looked at him, sunlight catching in his hair. And you found yours too, she said. He smiled. Maybe you gave me a little of yours. She laughed softly, shaking her head. No, you found it yourself. You just had to stop fighting the wrong battles. They fell into silence then, the kind that felt like understanding. The wind picked up, gentle, carrying the scent of salt and cedar from the water. She leaned on the railing beside him. The horizon stretched endlessly ahead, calm, luminous. You know, he said after a while, when I first met you, I didn't notice you at all. And then, when I finally did, I couldn't look away. Claire turned toward him, eyes soft. That's the thing about people. Evan, we only see what we're ready to. He nodded, gaze fixed on the rising sun. And now, she smiled, the light touching her face, golden and alive. Now, I don't need to be seen. I'm already here. The water shimmered beneath them, the sky a slow bloom of color pink to gold, gold to white. The city stirred awake behind them, but they stayed where they were, still, watching. It wasn't a grand ending, just quiet, honest, whole. Claire closed her eyes for a moment, breathing it all in, the salt in the air, the warmth of light against her skin, the sound of water folding against the shore, everything she had been running from, she had already outgrown. When she opened her eyes again, Evan was still watching her, a small smile tugging at his lips, not possessive, not uncertain, just present. And as the first rays of sunlight broke fully over Puget Sound, she stood there, not waiting to be noticed, not searching for permission, simply standing in her own light. She had once begged to be seen. Now, she simply stood in the light, and he never looked away. Life has a quiet way of teaching us that strength doesn't always come from holding on. Sometimes it comes from letting go. Claire's journey reminds us that self-worth isn't built through the approval of others, but through the courage to stand in our own truth. We spend so much of life wanting to be seen, to be recognized, to matter in someone else's story. Yet, peace begins when we finally learn to see ourselves not through the eyes of the world, but through compassion and honesty. It's never too late to start again, to open a window and let new light in. Change doesn't erase what we've lived through. It refines us. Whether in love, work, or friendship, what truly heals us is not perfection, but presence, the ability to show up as we are, every single day. And perhaps that is the quiet beauty of growing older, realizing that the greatest love story we can ever live is the one we write with ourselves, with patience, with forgiveness, and with light. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end of this story. If Claire's journey touched your heart or reminded you of your own strength, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue creating heartfelt stories that inspire, heal, and connect us all. Stay tuned for more emotional journeys, and remember, sometimes the smallest stories leave the deepest marks.